All right, let's talk it out Tuesday. Welcome back. So, this is where topics are not filtered. We just kind of have an open dialogue about what's currently going on in the world. So, I'm your host, Portia Booker, and I'm joined remotely with Kel Shabazz. Welcome, Kel Shabazz.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, a little background about Kel Shabazz. I went to high school with Kel Shabazz, and I've always been a fan of his poetry, his work. He is not only just a poet, he's also a Muslim. Well, thank you, Kel, for joining me on such short notice.
Oh, no problem.
So I know that, still we're in that discussion of, all the racial injustice, the protest, the future for Black Lives Matter and what we're doing moving forward. So for this episode, I kind of wanted to make it a little light and do something a little different. So, Kel, can you share with us the poem that you recently wrote in regards to what's currently going on?
Oh, yeah. So this poem is titled Pick Up the Gun. I wrote this poem in dedication to Corin Gaines, who was killed by the police back in 2016. And her death was it's a little more different from all the other deaths by police officers when interacting with unarmed Black people. So Corin Gaines' story, just to real briefly, just to enlighten people who are unfamiliar. Police officers were called to her home in a SWAT unit, I believe, and she had her son, and she hid her son into the closet, and she documented on her Instagram live at the time that the police have actually been stalking her and harassing her. She actually had a video of a police officer pulling her over, and she's pretty much saying how for the last previous weeks before this SWAT situation happened, police have been harassing and stalking her, and she had feared that they were coming to kill her. And the next thing you know, you have the SWAT at her door with guns. So just to make a long story short, they broke in and Corin Gaines, she engaged in a fire with the SWAT members, and they ended up killing her. And it caused this huge debate about whether or not Black people should bear arms and protect themselves. A debate about shooting against the police. Do you shoot at the police? And people who say that you don't. And you have those who believe in you should always defend yourself against people who are trying to kill you. And I decided to write this poem, Pick Up the Gun, in dedication to Corin Gaines, and also a little dedication to the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party. So the name of this poem is called Pick Up the Gun. Gun, pick up the gun, pick up the gun, cause the pigs wanna run. Pick up the gun, sing gun, pick up the gun, pick up the gun, cause the pigs wanna run. Pick up the gun. What does it mean to pick up the gun? To understand the kind of war you're in, the war you're in which you must defend. To do away with actions of defeat, dismantling doctrine that makes us docile and weak. What does it mean to pick up the gun, to pick up the gat, to pick up the strap? The white man acts and the Black man reacts, false actions that lead to self-destruction. We are not reactionary, but act when necessary. The message of revolution gets blurred by the white man's mean machine, causing coffee shop intellectuals to speak by any means without understanding what it means. What does it mean to pick up the gun, to pick up the gat, to pick up the strap? Ideological confusion. Brothers don't know who to point their guns at. Everybody got a gun, but white liberals want you to give yours up. Ain't no such thing as gun control. These white allies will have you out of touch. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. No more Negro excuses to submit, hiding behind religion. I pray for the pig while at the same time I off them. Send them straight into the slaughter. If you don't, you'll still be acting false actions at the graves of your sons and daughters. What does it mean to pick up the gun, to pick up the gat, to pick up the strap? You shoot for the three, you shoot for the DMs, you shoot for the loot, the game, and the rock. You love to shoot niggas, but you scared to shoot the cop. Word to pop. What does it mean to pick up the gun, to pick up the gat, to pick up the strap? For every generation, you must teach to fight for liberation. Shoot back at the Western imperialistic hustle, because Black life, your Black life, don't belong to nobody but the struggle. Gun, pick up the gun, pick up the gun, cause the pigs on the run. Pick up the gun, sing gun, pick up the gun, pick up the gun, cause the pigs on the run. Pick up the gun, one more time. Gun, pick up the gun, pick up the gun, cause the pigs on the run. Pick up the gun.
Well, thank you, Kelton. Again, your poetry is always phenomenal. I always love hearing it.
Oh, no
Um,
problem.
I mean, pick up the gun. What do you think of when you hear somebody say that? Pick up the gun. For me, that's instantly run for me
Mm-hmm.
because I've only shot in a gun maybe twice,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't like it. I mean, probably if I practice, I could be good at it, but just
Well,
hearing that, I'm running away.
yeah. So to understand the philosophy behind picking up the gun, I always say all the time, we have to start studying the blueprints and the philosophy of our former, more militant-minded leaders. When people speak about revolution, revolution is more to it than just, oh, we pick up the gun, we start shooting. It's more about discipline. It's more about, being there for your brothers and sisters and be willing to defend yourself and fight back from an imperialistic structure that has been designed to actually kill you. And people talk about revolution. I know revolution, it scares a lot of people, but revolution just means change, and that change comes by force. And when we study history, we know that no people who ever seek liberation got their liberation by, singing, or they got their liberation by being peaceful and turning the other cheek. In fact, all people who suck out their liberation got it through the acts of a revolution, whether it's American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. You can go on and on and on. And for the longest, we have followed these doctrines, and we followed these talking points from people telling Black people that you shouldn't handle it through violence. But all of white supremacy in the history of America is violence, and how they interact with us is through violence. And picking up the gun does not mean simply you pick up the gun and go out to seek the violence and you go out to cause the violence, but it's more of a matter of when violence is coming to you, you as a human being have the right to protect yourself, to protect your family, and protect your livelihood. And when somebody is constantly keeping their foot on your neck and applying that pressure, you have the mean by any means, to do whatever you have to do to get that foot off your neck. And I believe that picking up the gun, is a thing that must be preached amongst our people. And I always explain to the brothers on the street, students who I've had in the classroom who have been involved in, gang-related activities. I always say all the time, you know, you will take that gun, and that same gun you picking up, you will kill your fellow brother without hesitation, just because he's not from the same neighborhood as you or he looked at you the wrong way. But then you have, these white supremacists dressed up in blue, wearing badges. They'll come in your neighborhood, they'll bash your head against the pavement, they'll stomp on your kids, they'll sexually harass, the women in your family, and you won't do nothing. You won't do nothing. So my thing is, I think Black families and Black communities have to start being willing to defend themselves from racist brutality.
I agree. You hit on a lot there, Kelton, and that's been one of my things when it comes to guns, is
Mm-hmm.
that we'll defend against our own, but not against what's killing us
Right.
as a majority. And I can't seem to understand that. It and like I said, I've never grown up around gang violence and different things like that, so I can't really understand it. But considering what just happened here, the protests for George Floyd, he was wrongfully murdered by this cop in Minnesota. We're preaching Black Lives Matter, but do Black Lives matter to Black people?
Mm.
Will this cause another revolution? will this cause another shift and put more things into perspective where we value ourselves and our brothers and sisters in our community?
Mhm. Yeah, because even, you know, when you peel back the layers to a lot of these things that greatly impact, Black people here in the United States, and you peel back the layers and you see that all this stuff comes from the same power structure. So whenever I talk about Black on Black crime, one, people have to understand that, like, Black people, for centuries and years and years and years, we have been conditioned and programmed to think of ourselves as less than, to think of people who look like us as less than. Violence. America has been built on violence. America promotes violence. You see it everywhere you go, whether it's music, movies, war, all these things. America embraces. They love violence, and Black people who have been placed in conditions such as poverty, you know, we all know with poverty comes crime. These people are simply pretty much fighting to stay alive. And when you're fighting to stay alive, you tend to inflict out actions that are more self-destructing than anything. And when I talk about Black on Black crime, when you have the self-hate, I say it all the time to a former student of mine that if you've been taught to hate yourself, you've been taught to hate Black skin and see no value in it at all. When you walk down the street and you see somebody else who has that same skin color, that same look that you have, that you've been conditioned to hate, what are you gonna do to it? What do you do to something that you hate? And you destroy it, you kill it. And psychologically, when Black people are killing each other, whether it's a gang bang, a drive-by shooting, or which have you, psychologically you killing yourself. In your mind, you thinking you're killing yourself. And with every killing that happens is Black males thinking that they're killing themselves because deep down inside they hate themselves. We've been taught to hate ourselves and hate people who look like us. And you can only react to actions that you've been taught, that you've been conditioned to be around. you know, Even back on the slave plantations, when all of the way of life that African people known and knew, it was stripped away, and they had to learn a new way of living. And the main authority that was best example at the time, was your white slave master. He dominated the plantation, he dominated his family, he dominated the nation he lived in. And the best way that the slave master got enslaved Africans to fear them was to inflict violence. And it's like, okay, well, he's inflicting violence on us, and it's being instilled in you. Now you have this fear. And it's the same thing when you talk about Black male masculinity. You go talk to a lot of young men, they'll tell you that, being a man is inflicting your dominance. People only respect you when you can be violent. Who's the most violent? These are things that have not always been our way of life and how we view things. I always challenge people to study what was the way of life being viewed through the lens of African people before slavery, before colonization, and those things of that such nature. Where do we get this violence approach from? And you'll definitely be surprised at the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, because you hit on a good point saying that, America was founded on violence. It was. I mean, when Native Americans were here, their land was stolen from them. We were brought over from Africa, not even by choice,
Right.
and so probably that was also a violent struggle as well, you know. Um, and so that's what I'm saying, Kelton. Where we're at now, the protest, and we're getting the message across that Black lives are also important as well. We're not just saying that only Black lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of blew me for a loop when people were like, oh, you guys are only saying that Black lives are the only thing that's important. No, that's never been the case at all. But
Mm-hmm.
I think moving forward, how can we change that viewpoint, Kelton, where Black people also value Black lives as well?
Well, this comes with education and reteaching and teaching knowledge of self. And what knowledge of self is I feel like every young Black person is going through this phase, or not necessarily a phase, but have gone through a transition when you start educating yourself on the history of your peoples and the things that your ancestors done. What was life like before you ever encountered slavery and colonization? You start realizing that, Black people, we were teachers, we were scientists, we were, political leaders and builders. You start seeing all these great things that you don't even necessarily get taught in school. See, so many times in the school setting, they start our history off with slavery. So all this time when you teaching yourself that, okay, my history starts with being a slave. Now, one, that's not even self-motivating. When you teach somebody that their history starts with being a slave and not being a doctor or a teacher, those things, it's like, okay, how is this going to motivate me to want to do anything? Because psychologically, you're teaching me that I'm nothing but a slave. I'll never amount to anything. I'm average. And I think a lot of Black people have to start studying the histories of their own people, studying the history of their ancestors, and the things that we used to do, so you can gain that knowledge itself. And what comes with knowledge itself is more greater respect, not only to yourself, but to the people who look like you, people who come from the same place you come from. And you'll start to understand the struggle more. And once you get past those many different ills that's holding us back, even when you look into these communities that suffer from all that violence, Black on Black crime, these communities are filled with drugs. These communities are filled with alcohol. Even loan shops. Keeping the economics, even lower for people. The resources, the poor schooling in these neighborhoods. All of these things aid to that. Before you can even think to battle any of those things, you got to first start with yourself. And then once you get knowledge of self and you start to understand who your people are, where they come from, and understand the situation that you and your people are in now, then you can go tackle on that problem of white supremacy with the greater respect of your brother and your sister. So I definitely think that, knowledge itself is important. And with knowledge itself, you build those things like sympathy and empathetic, being empathetic towards your brother and sister and understanding and feeling the same pain that they going through, and you won't just look at them as if their lives have no value or meaning.
Kelton, you hit on a very strong point where you talked about slavery. And I remember back in elementary school, that's the main thing they teach in African American history. They may touch on Martin Luther King. They may touch on, you know, maybe some of the sports figures like, Jackie Robinson.
Right.
But what else do you hear? You don't hear about any big Black doctors. You don't even hear about Black Wall Street.
Oh yeah.
I didn't even learn about Black Wall Street until I even moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2016 when I was a TV producer. And it was close to the time when I was moving away from Tulsa where I encountered a woman who was trying to bring back Black Wall Street in Tulsa.
Oh yeah. In schools, if I give you a rundown of how Black history is taught in schools, it's like, okay, you started off as a slave, then they'll give you a little Harriet Tubman, probably a little tiny bit of Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass, then they'll leapfrog. All right, so we'll go to Martin Luther King. They'll teach you that, Martin Luther King, he had this big old march and gave the I Have a Dream speech. And, and then he had to go up against this guy named Malcolm X, who was the big bad guy. So Martin Luther King was the good guy. He gave the speech, and that right there pretty much ended racism. And then they'll leapfrog again, right? And then they'll go to Obama. They'll go to Barack Obama and say, oh, well, what do you know? We got a Black president, post-racial America, the end. And it's like, I've been saying it for the last few weeks at some of these protests. If you want solutions, the first step is to start telling the truth of the problem and how things are. And in the education system, it's like, teach Black history accurately. If you want to teach about slavery, you need to teach about every detail, every bit of piece that enslaved people went through. Because see, nowadays they soften up slavery because they don't want to make people uncomfortable. They don't want people to know all the things and pains that those people actually endured. and then even after slavery, when you want to jump into Jim Crow, you talk about all of the lynchings that took place. You talk about, the Emmett Tills of the world. You want to talk about Martin Luther King, but talk about Martin Luther King's story completely, because towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King's views slightly started to change. He kind of started talking about, or start taking ideas that Malcolm X once had. He started taking a radical approach. Martin Luther King actually regretted his "I Have a Dream" speech when he told in the conversation with Harry Belafonte. And Harry Belafonte talks about this in one of his books that he wrote about MLK. And Martin Luther King told him that he felt like he made a mistake giving that speech. He felt like he made a mistake that he had integrated his people into a burning house. Because even after he gave that speech, you had the bombing, the church bombing with the 4 little girls dying. And I just feel like you're gonna tell that history, tell it thoroughly and tell it accurately. The minute Martin Luther King started speaking out against the war that America was having, the Vietnam War, that's when they decided to put a bullet in him. Malcolm X. You want to talk about Malcolm X? One, tell the truth. Malcolm X was not about violence. Malcolm X was about self-defense, which we touched on earlier. And then, you want to talk about how Malcolm X heightened his ideas from Black nationalism to Pan-Africanism, how he traveled through different places in Africa and met with different heads of states who had recently attained their liberation and forming alliances. And he was building that different alliance across the diaspora, and how he had plans to take the United States to world court, and to try to seek justice. People don't talk about those kind of things. So, and then to leapfrog from the civil rights movement to Obama is just, it's just a disrespect to all of the things that Black people have gone through. People don't even talk about the Black Power movement in school. Like, you very rarely hear about the Black Power movement. And it wasn't until 2016 when Beyonce, she performed at the Super Bowl with the Black Panther theme, and people started to acknowledge the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. And people started to really get into, okay, the Black Panther Party. Well, how come they don't teach about the Black Panther Party? How come they don't teach that Ronald Reagan, pretty much made laws so that Black people couldn't really carry guns after seeing the Black Panther Party show up, to the doorsteps at the state capitol with guns? Why is that? People, they don't really teach the real mission of the Black Panther Party was to police the police, something that we need now. And all of those different leaders that pretty much get left out of our history. We have allowed our history to be taken and cut and paste so many times by the powers that be. They have us arguing between who's better between MLK and Malcolm. They give Martin a national holiday, but if you choose wisely, the thing about it is that they pick and choose what kind of leaders they want to give recognition to. That they choose Martin because to them, Martin was less threatening. How come there's not a holiday for a Malcolm X or a Marcus Garvey? You don't teach about people like Assata Shakur or Angela Davis. Some of these leaders are still alive. And even Black political leaders like Imam Jamil Amin, formerly known as Brother H. Rat Brown, these are political leaders who are still locked up till this day. So those are a lot of things that kind of get cut and paste out. And I think one of the things that Black people have to do is start taking control of the narrative, start taking control of our history, and making sure that it's being taught accurately.
Absolutely, Kelton. You hit the nail on the head where you brought up that our history is cut and pasted, and it's jumped around. Like, they jumped from MLK all the way to Obama. That's right. What, 60 years?
Right.
So what happened in between there? We're right. All been just under a rock sleeping. I mean, it's funny. It makes me think of for 9/11, how they wanted to create this documentary for elementary school kids to understand 9/11. And I'm thinking, there's no way for you to explain this concept nicely. Same thing with slavery.
Right.
So I agree. I think not just for this protest, we need to make a whole total shift in the
Mm-hmm.
education system where we're teaching not just, you know, slavery of Black history. We need to teach about Black Wall Street. We need to teach about our leaders outside of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and even Rosa Parks and even Marcus Garvey. Some of the ones that created a lot of the modern day um, tools that we use today. Because there's a lot of them that created wonderful things
Oh yeah.
that we use that they are not getting credit for. That
Oh yeah.
most people, they hear the name, they're like, "Who is that?" And you're like, "Don't you see? You're using what they created." you know.
Yeah, and the thing with Marcus Garvey, and I just want to put this out there would be no Martin Luther King and Malcolm X if there wasn't no Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, the UNIA, he had literally the largest Black movement in the entire Western Hemisphere. So it's like, how does Marcus Garvey get left out? Like literally, his Back to Africa movement was like the largest Black movement ever over here in the Western world. So the fact that he gets left out, and it's astounding. And Marcus Garvey, like I said, if there wasn't no Marcus Garvey, there would be no Martin Luther King for people to always bring up, or Malcolm X.
Well, then you also brought up that they pick and choose who they want people to know,
Right.
and that's also the problem. You can't pick and choose history when it happened.
Right.
So we need to change that shift. We also need to be more inclusive in our schools and even down to inside of the homes. My mom has a book that talks about Black first for
Mm-hmm.
everything starting from like the early 1800s up until I think maybe like 2010 is this book that she has, and it's wonderful. I mean, it talks about everything you could think of, from the first like Black community radio station to the hospital, medicine. I mean, there's a whole wealth of knowledge in that book. We need to include that in everyday conversation to make our people proud. When our kids are going to school, we want them to know you are somebody. You come from a lineage
Right.
of strong people, not just a slave.
Right.
So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done when it comes to being inclusive and really standing for Black Lives Matter.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a lot of work. I'll say that these protests is just the first step. We made a lot of noise. We got a lot of people's attentions, and now I say we got to start throwing out the demands. There are some demands that I think that we need to start issuing, and those demands aren't met. I think we got to keep applying that pressure.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Kelton. Well, thank you again for coming on, Kelton. Um, can you leave our listeners with some words of advice, moving forward? You know, we're kind of going into the trial of the four officers involved in George Floyd, but what can you leave with them today, Kelton?
My advice would be, if you're just now getting into the transition of studying and getting knowledge yourself or what have you, keep studying, keep being vocal. If people, or you are confronting people who may have views that are threatening, and the reason why I say threatening is because anybody that's against Black lives being considered mattered, or having value, that's threatening, and that's a problem. But keep confronting them, call them out, and tell the truth to their face. You tell the truth to white supremacy, tell the truth to America, and continue doing that, even if it's within your own household, family members, friends. Don't let anybody hinder you from the path that you're going on. An old professor of mine at Cleveland State told me the story about the leader in the Chinese Revolution. And he talked about like the wall of China, and he was saying how, the leader was giving the Chinaman 12 years to get on board. You got 12 years to decide that, you want to be part of this movement, you want to be part of this change. And if not, you have to get on the other side of that wall. So my main thing is don't let anybody hinder the path that you're on. They can either be with it or not. If you don't want to be with it, in the words of Kwame Ture, said revolution knows no compromise. Either you on a train or you're gonna get ran over.